Within weeks of joining the war campaign, the United States immediately made its presence felt. And the scale of the war, which had been largely a stalemate, which we'll talk about in a little bit, balanced directly towards the Allies. So Britain was suffering vast amount of losses from German submarine attacks, as well as its ability to receive various different supplies from overseas, enter in the United States military, and American naval destroyers were able to hunt down German U boats and drastically reduce the number of attacks that they could carry out onto British and American vessels. So results were pretty dramatic. You had Allied ships that lost 900,000 tons of goods in April 1917, and by October 1918, it was down to 112,000 a month. So they were still losing a little bit, but that's a drastic improvement. America makes its presence felt in the First World War. To kind of complicate some things, the Russians, those guys that are also on our side, supposedly, they're having an internal conflict. There is a Russian revolution going on where you have a struggle between the old Romanov regime and the new Marxist-Leninists, led by Vladimir Lenin, who was a communist leader who led a communist revolution in Russia. And he pitted the white Russians, those of the old Romanov Empire, against the Reds, the communists. And upon the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin would negotiate a hasty peace with the Central Powers and an exit from World War I so as to carry on their own affairs. Now, with German troops no longer needing to occupy the Eastern Front against the Russians, they could now reallocate west against the British and the French. Okay? So that's one thing. However, the United States, when we first sent troops over to Europe, we didn't have enough to fulfill for what would need to be the massive scale. So in a volunteer army, hopefully you would have enough supplies and efficiency so as to get the job done. The scale of this war required far, far more volume. So about 121,000 men enlisted in the armed forces, but a force far larger would be needed. So it was during this time that Woodrow Wilson fought for and eventually saw passage of the Selective Service Act. So today, the Selective Service Act still exists. When you are 18 years old, especially if you're a male, you are supposed to go and register for selective service in the event of a draft. Now, there has not been a draft in United States history since the Vietnam War, but in the event of something necessary, if you were of age and you were physically capable, you could theoretically be called to service. It was during this time in World War I that a draft would be instituted and would be used a few other different times in American history. This is the way that eventually the United States Army would grow into several million, over half of which would make their way to the European theater, and they would fight against the Central Powers. 72% of all who served in World War I were draftees. They were drafted into service. Okay? So your typical American soldier was typically a young, poor white boy who wasn't really well educated, maybe in his late teens or early 20s. Back then, women could not serve. Black men could serve, but typically they had their own units, and the majority of them were conscripted to various different services, or particularly black-held units, most of which did not see the front lines. So oftentimes they were subjected to doing various different laborious acts or anything else of the sort. Most of them didn't see combat. some units were made entirely of African Americans. There were various different things also that required U.S. soldiers from all walks to go through various aspects of training. So, as is standard today, all whether you're a draftee or you register for service, if you are enlisted, you will go through an Army basic training. So today, Army basic training is about 10 weeks of rigorous training so as to assimilate into Army culture and to teach you disciplinary ways and what the Army expects from you. And you've got to compose yourself in a certain way. You have to organize yourself in a certain way. You have to learn to follow orders and work amongst your peers in a certain different way. You have to wear your uniform and learn how to use weaponry in certain ways. You have to understand the basic structure of the Army so as to understand your tactics and the overall objective towards accomplishing your goal. So there has to be some sort of way to receive a moral instruction from a military standpoint that could unify all forces that could lead towards a successful military campaign otherwise. So the United States Army has recruit basic training. The United States Marine Corps has basically the same thing. They just refer to it as boot camp as opposed to basic training. It's essentially the same thing. They just have various different tactics. The Marines, it's a little bit longer, and then there's also a water element to their training as well. But otherwise, though, basic training would be the emphasis for how those serving in the armed forces could train and therefore understand their tasks and their military role. The United States makes an immediate impact on the European front, and largely an American Expeditionary Force makes its way into France in the summer of 1917, and it really wasn't until the following year, early in the next spring in 1918, that Americans really make a difference. They had sparse activity in 1917. Keep in mind, the war had been going on since 1914. That's when Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. The war had been going on since 1914. It wasn't until the spring of 1918 that the United States really made direct contact with Germans and their offensives. And eventually, Americans would make enough of an advance to engage very large German forces. One of the more infamous battles in United States Marine Corps history is the Battle of Belleau Wood. That is where a significant number of Marines died fighting to save and to capture and overcome a German force in the Belleau Wood region of France. And Marines suffered a significant number of casualties, but they got the job done. Belleau Wood became a rallying cry for Marines and the can-do attitude and advancement attitude that Marines carry to this day. It's ingrained in Marine Corps culture. And along with American Army soldiers and other Allied forces, they were able to push German forces back quite significantly. By the next fall, in September of 18, American troops continued to pour into France, and German forces began to pull back. Eventually, there would be somewhat of a stalemate, though. As there had been earlier in the war, American forces engaged German troops in oftentimes a stalemate to where they would dig trenches that would eventually become miles long and 10 feet deep. And if you lifted your head from out of the fence to overlook, you'd probably get shot. Okay? You would have a trench warfare in dire conditions, unsanitary, filled with rats, all kinds of gross different things going on in the trench warfare. But for a brief time, that was the reality of that war. Now, one of the things that also helps is if you have really good communication. So by this time, you had primitive telephones and cordless phones that could relay messages to your commanders. Well, part of the reality of these communication aspects is that they could be tapped and wiretapped by the enemy. So consider this: if you're an American military unit and you're calling in for various different advancements or other instructions, there could be Germans tapping into that message trying to decipher your advancements. And if they know what's coming, well, you can be ambushed or otherwise have your plans destroyed. So, United States, one of the advantages to having such a diverse population is that there are many languages spoken in the United States, many of whom are completely foreign to Europeans. Enter in Native Americans, specifically from the Choctaw tribe this time. You would have folks and servicemen who were registered in the Choctaw tribe speak in relay messages in Choctaw code so as to relay American advancements, and the Germans had no idea what they were doing with it. They'd never seen Choctaw language before. So you had the advancement of Native American code talkers, in this case, Choctaw code talkers. We're going to talk about others in World War II as well. You also had some African American units who saw the field at times. Largely, as I mentioned earlier, they were relegated to more menial type roles in the Army in general outside the battlefield. But generally speaking, there were African Americans that did serve. Otherwise, though, the fall of 1918, particularly October, was very bloody for all combatants, especially Americans. As we were finally pushing the Germans outside of the Meuse-Argonne region, that push and offensive was very deadly for Americans. Upwards of around 27,000 Americans died as a result of pushing the Germans beyond the Meuse-Argonne region and back towards their territory. I want you to think about that. In America's involvement in Iraq, there were about 5,000 servicemen who died as a result of our multi-year involvement in that country. About 5,000. That's 5,000 too many, if you ask me. But that happened over a span of 9, 10, 11 years. Okay? 27,000 Americans died in a month. That's how large this war was, and that's how brutal it was. In Vietnam, in our 12 years there in Vietnam, 58,000 Americans lost their lives. That's 58,000 too many. Half that number died in 1 month in France in World War I, October 1918. So it was very costly. However, despite the horrible slaughter and ghastliness of this war, American forces were ultimately too much to overcome. There were just too many of us. And even though the British were very weak and the French were weak, we just had too many people for the Germans to be able to overcome. And eventually we pushed them back. We had weakened them. We had basically starved their civilian population because we had a successful blockade of their coast. They weren't able to trade. And eventually we beat them back into Germany, and they prepared for an incoming invasion. But instead of an invasion, the Germans saw the writing on the wall and they agreed to an end of fighting. On November 11th, 1918, the Allied powers and the Central powers signed an armistice. That's an official end to fighting. The end of the war officially would come elsewhere. But the end of the fighting came on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918. November 11th is the day that we celebrate all veterans in American history. So Memorial Day in late May is the day that we celebrate all who served, who died as a result of their service, whether in combat or otherwise. Veterans Day is a day where we celebrate all veterans. Those currently serving, past serve, whether they died or lived or not. Okay, that's an important distinction between the two. Okay, so Memorial Day is the day that we celebrate all Americans who died in American wars. Okay, Veterans Day, we celebrate all veterans. On Armistice Day, the day that the armistice was declared in World War I.